Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Toronto and Scarborough Electric Railway. This was an interurban line that ran between Queen Street and West Hill in Scarborough. I did briefly go over this line in my video on the Kingston Road streetcar, so this one will be a bit more in depth. So, let's get into the video. The origins of the Toronto and Scarborough Electric Railway begin in the late 1800s, although transit along what would become the Scarborough line predates it. For that we have to go all the way back to June 9, 1875, when the Kingston Road Tramway Company established a freight tramway line. This was a 5.1 kilometer line that ran along Queen Street and Kingston Road between the Don River gravel pits and Main Street. As stated before, this was a freight tramway that used horse-drawn cars to haul supplies for the Toronto Gravel Road and Concrete Company. The tramway would also carry passengers, but this was more of a secondary function, with its primary one being freight movement. 3 years later, in 1878, the tramway would be extended 1.1 kilometers east to Victoria Park Avenue. The tramway would continue to operate for another 6 years before shutting down in 1884. Kingston Road would remain without transit for 8 years. All of that would change on August 18, 1892, when the Toronto and Scarborough Electric Railway Light and Power Company was established. The company would be led by a board of directors headed by Henry Mill Palat, who was a well-known stockbroker and financier. Two other names of note were Joseph Leroy and A.W. Dingman, who had previously worked for the previously mentioned Kingston Road Tramway Company. Dingman specifically would become the secretary-manager of the Toronto and Scarborough. The company would obtain operating charters from 4 separate municipalities to operate their planned service along Kingston Road. Those municipalities being York County, the York Township, the village of East Toronto, and the Scarborough Township. In these charters, it would be stated that the company was required to operate at least 2 cars each way in the morning and evening. Adult fares could not exceed 2 cents per mile, and the route would be built to the streetcar gauge of 4 feet 10 7/8 inches. Finally, the company was expected to, in time, operate a service all the way to West Hill in the Scarborough Township. In an article by the Toronto Globe, it would be stated, Toronto and Scarborough Railway Light and Power Company was organized for the purpose of constructing and maintaining a complete belt line railway system and operating it by electricity through the villages of East Toronto, Little York, Norway, Todmorden, and Chester, and between the villages and the city of Toronto, and connecting the villages and the summer resorts Kew Beach, Balmy Beach, Palisades Park, Scarborough Heights, etc. with the city of Toronto. To construct suitable and necessary spurs and branches for connecting other towns, villages, etc. with the road for accommodation of passengers, freight, and other traffic. And for the further purpose of supplying the towns, villages, resorts, and residents along and near the line of the road with light, heat, and power for township, municipal, domestic, farming, manufacturing, and other uses. Construction of the interurban would not commence for a year, with construction finally starting in May of 1893. The Toronto Globe would state of the company, it aimed at securing the maximum traffic at the minimum cost of construction and operations. The promoters believe that, in general, the maximum traffic should be the predominant consideration, while minimum cost of operation should be obtained even at the expense of increased cost of construction. The T&SER's Scarborough line would begin operations on July 1, 1893. The line would run a 3.2 kilometer route on the north side of Kingston Road between Queen Street and Blantyre Avenue. Additional stops were probably located at Columbine Avenue, Norway, Main Street, and Charles Street. I say probably as I couldn't find exactly what was happening here, and I am just working off some images and historic maps to find the spots that would make the most sense. Cars for the route would be stored at a shed near Walter Street. The cars themselves were built by either the Toronto Railway Company or the Ottawa Car Company. I couldn't find out whom exactly. The interior of the cars were lined with cherry wood with bird's eye maple veneer ceilings, high rattan-covered seating, and all windows featured pull-down blinds. Lastly, the cars featured a separate vestibule at each end to protect the operator and conductor from the elements and further separate the passengers from the elements. Cars would operate along the route at 12 miles per hour, or 19 kilometers per hour. Expansion for the Scarborough line would come quickly, as before the route even opened, a further extension south on Blantyre Avenue was already under construction. As well, the T&SER was also considering the construction of a branch line into the village of East Toronto and Little York. The Toronto Globe would state, "It is the intention of the board to push the building of the road on down Blantyre Avenue to Queen Street and then west by way of Queen Street to meet the line of the Toronto Railway Company at the eastern city limit. It is also intended to build the road up through East Toronto and into Little York this season if at all possible." It would go on to further state, "When entirely completed, it will enable residents of East Toronto, Little York, Todmorden, Chester, Scarborough, Kew Beach, Balmy Beach, and the lake shore along the line of the road between these points and the city to reach the heart of the city as quickly as the residents of the other suburban districts." I do want to bring up that this article mentions Todmorden and Chester as places served by the Scarborough line. This can't be true though, as Todmorden and Chester are nowhere near Kingston Road. They are along Broadview Avenue in what we would today call East York. So either the author of the article is mixing some places up, or the T&SER had a concept of an idea to create a line into what is today East York. If that is the case, then this article may be the only place it is documented. Either way, a week later the T&SER would open its Blantyre Avenue branch. This would be an 895-meter branch line from Kingston Road south on Blantyre Avenue to Queen Street and then west to the city limit at Victoria Park Avenue. A small part of this extension would run on an elevated structure to get over a depression in the ground just south of Kingston Road. I call it a branch line as this part of the route was only used in the summer, and for that reason it is also safe to assume it had no mid-block stops. Specifically, this branch was built to serve the popular Victoria Park, which was a lakeside park with picnic and recreation grounds. Yes, that does also mean that the street is named after a park that no longer exists. It's now the R.C. Harris Water Treatment Plant. A year later in 1894, the T&SER would open its Walter Street branch. This would be a 728-meter branch line that would run north up Walter Street, west on Lyle Avenue, north on Kimberley Street, and west on Gerrard Street to Main Street. Due to the short distance, it is unlikely there was a mid-block station on this branch. The T&SER had planned to extend the Walter Street branch further into the village of Little York, which was centered on Dawes Road just north of Danforth Avenue. This extension would never be built. The T&SER intended to lean heavily into the summer excursion business, as they had been looking at the possibility of using double-deck cars in the summer, like on the Mimico line. The Toronto Globe would state, "To further enhance the attractiveness of the route, it is proposed to place upon it for the summer business magnificently appointed double-decked cars, such as is used with so much favor in both the United States, in Great Britain, and on the continent. This line is bound to develop and to bring into popular favor some of the prettiest pleasure resorts and suburban residential districts that there are in the neighborhood of the city of Toronto, and must of necessity become the most popular of all rapid transit lines running out of Toronto." The proposed double-deck cars would never be purchased. On March 8, 1895, the Toronto and Scarborough would be purchased by the Toronto Railway Company. Why they did this is unknown, although it has been speculated that perhaps the TRC had money to burn. Maybe the T&SER was dirt cheap. Or perhaps it was because the Toronto Railway Company's owner, Sir William Mackenzie, was friends with the Toronto and Scarborough's owner, Henry Pallott. Whatever the reason, the Scarborough line was now part of the Toronto Railway Company, although it remained a separate entity operationally. As part of this purchase, the Scarborough line would be connected to the TRC's streetcar network. This wasn't for through service though. It was to facilitate the storage and maintenance of the line's cars at the TRC's King Car House. The old shed at Walter Street would be torn down. Things for the Scarborough line would quickly turn sour though, as on July 13th, a Scarborough line car would be involved in a major head-on collision that resulted in the deaths of 2 children who were on a Sunday school picnic excursion. 6 others were also injured in the crash. A later inquest into the accident would lay the blame on casual operating procedures and inadequate brakes on the cars. Charles Wilson, a manager for the later Toronto and York Radial Railway, would state of the incident, "The resulting publicity interfered with the earnings of this line, and the railway for 2 years after the accident did not pay its way." With the route being hit financially from the accident and the success of the Walter Street branch, the Blantyre branch found itself in a more marginal role. After all, it was only used during the summer. Because of this, the T&SER would opt to end service on the Blantyre branch in 1897. It is also possible the TRC's pending extension of the King streetcar to Monroe Park Avenue played a role in this decision. Either way, the tracks along Blantyre Avenue were torn up, but they did not go to waste. The tracks would be reused for a 526-meter extension of the Scarborough line east to the Toronto Hunt Club. As part of this extension, the route would cut across and run along the south side of Kingston Road. Additional stops would be located at Courcelette Road and Mans. The old terminal at Blantyre Avenue would be removed and a new one constructed at Victoria Park Avenue. This extension was built for 2 possible reasons. The first was the Scarborough Township had grown impatient waiting for its namesake Interurban to enter the town and had been threatening to revoke the company's operating charter. Another possible reason is that it was a favor to Sir William Mackenzie's business partner Donald Mann, who owned a country estate just west of the Hunt Club. In truth though, the T&SER did not want to extend its service into Scarborough, as the township was still wholly rural and had little in the way of residential or commercial development along Kingston Road. In fact, the Scarborough Township had been seeing its population decrease. From 3,800 in 1895 down to 3,700 in 1900, 3,500 in 1905, and 3,400 in 1910. Or about 100 to 200 people every 5 years. It would be 4 years before the Scarborough line saw its next begrudging extension. This time it would be a 3.7 kilometer extension of the route east to the halfway house at Midland Avenue, opening on July 12, 1901. Additional stops were located at Hunt Club Switch, Warden Avenue, Valhalla Avenue, Birchcliff Avenue, Birchmount, Manning's Switch, West's, Kennedy Road, Monroe's, and Jones. The halfway house in this case isn't a correctional institution, but instead a social club that dates back to the 1820s. It gets its name from the fact that at the time it was built, it was a popular rest stop and hotel for stagecoaches, roughly halfway between Pickering and York. According to Edwin C. Goulet, in Pioneer Inns and Taverns Volume 1, when the Interurban reached the house, it had evolved into a social center for sleighing parties, dances in the huge ballroom, and bicycling expeditions. Enthusiasts would park their bicycles at the hotel and use the cars back and forth. 2 months later, in September of 1901, the T&SER would begin operating Sunday service on the route. On August 1, 1904, Sir William Mackenzie would form the Toronto and York Radial Railway, and the Scarborough line would be folded into the new company, becoming the Scarborough Division. After this, the old shed at Walter Street would be rebuilt, and storage and maintenance of the line's cars would be moved back to it. The next extension for the Scarborough line would begrudgingly come 5 months later, opening on January 23, 1905. This extension would see the Scarborough line extended 3 kilometers to Mason Switch at Bellamy Road. Additional stops would be located at St. Augustine Seminary, China Mission, Brimley Road, 16A, Scarborough High School, Nielsen's, St. Joseph's School, McCowan's, and Scarborough Heights Park. 12 months later, on December 24th, the Scarborough line would receive an additional 950-meter extension to Scarborough Post Office at Markham Road. An additional stop would be located at Gates. 8 months later, on August 31st, 1906, the Scarborough line would receive its final extension. The route would be extended 4.7 kilometers east to Fairwood Crescent in West Hill. North of what is today Dale Avenue, the route would cross onto the north side of Kingston Road and run on its own right-of-way over the Grand Trunk Railway tracks, today's Lakeshore East Line. It would then continue on the north side of Kingston Road. Additional stops would be located at Cornell's, Scarborough Post Office, the old Scarborough Post Office stop would be renamed to Markham Road, Scarborough Golf Club, Christchurch, Lennox's, Gravel Pit, Hewlett's, Eads Corners, 32A, St. Margaret's Church, and Sideline. This extension also featured a siding at the Gravel Pit for freight service. Service on the route was once every half hour to McCowan Road and every hour to West Hill. The terminus at Fairwood Crescent was quite modern, featuring a restaurant, barbershop, reading room, and a long-distance telephone that was quite popular apparently. It of course also had the standard trappings of an indoor waiting area and places for riders to park their horses while they head into the city. The 1900s and 1910s for the Scarborough line would be relatively quiet, with only a couple of minor changes occurring. Firstly, at some point a new car house for the line would be constructed just east of Warden Avenue. The old shed at Walter Street would be torn down for the second time. In 1912, the TNYRR would establish an electric park along Kingston Road called Scarborough Heights Park. This was a large 60-acre park along the shores of Lake Ontario, bounded by Bellamy Road to the east and Midland Avenue in the west. The TNYRR would construct a spur line down Faircroft Boulevard to access the park. Manager of the Toronto and York, Charles Wilson, would stayed of the park in 1937. Many excursions from Sunday schools, clubs, and so forth were held there every day during the summer. We built at the top of the bluff a pavilion and a refreshment stand which added to the popularity. With this pavilion and the car service, the park was extremely popular, and every night there were dances, and as automobiles at the time were not as popular as at the present, we did particularly good business. The TNYRR would run summer excursion cars to the park mirroring similar services offered on the Metropolitan and Mimico lines to Bond Lake and Long Branch Park respectively. In 1913, the Toronto and York would close the Walter Street branch of the Scarborough line as local residents preferred to use the Toronto Civic Railway's Gerrard Streetcar to get downtown. The 1920s would see changes made to the Scarborough line. Firstly, on August 16, 1922, the Toronto and York Radial Railway would be purchased by the City of Toronto and with it the Scarborough line. The city would assume financial responsibility of the route while operations would be contracted out to the Ontario Hydroelectric Railway on November 1st. As part of this purchase, on December 1st, the section of the Scarborough line within Toronto would be handed over to the TTC. Specifically, the Scarborough line would be cut back to Victoria Park Avenue in the west. Everything west of it to Queen Street would now be handled by the Queen Streetcar. Ontario Hydro would make some improvements to the Scarborough line. They would construct a new terminal station at Victoria Park Avenue, as not only had service been cut back, but the route had been severed from the rest of the streetcar network. They would also bring over 5 cars from their Guelph district. These cars were standard gauge cars, as Ontario Hydro had planned to re-gauge the Scarborough line to standard gauge as it had done to the Mimico line. By the mid-1920s, the Scarborough line, like Toronto's other interurbans, was seeing declining ridership. The Scarborough line carried 1,261,628 riders in 1923. This would drop to 1,181,895 3 years later in 1926. In fact, the Scarborough line had the lowest ridership of Ontario Hydro's 3 Toronto-based interurbans. With Ontario Hydro losing money, the City of Toronto would decide to end its operating contract and handed Toronto's interurbans over to the TTC on January 12, 1927. The TTC would move to streamline service on its interurbans, and in the case of the Scarborough line, they would reconnect the line to the rest of the streetcar network on January 25th. Through service was never operated, and this connection was simply to allow for the Scarborough cars to be stored and maintained at Russell Car House. The Scarborough line's old car house at Warden Avenue was closed but not torn down. Through the early summer of 1927, the TTC would re-gauge the Scarborough line to standard gauge. They would then put the 5 cars brought over by Ontario Hydro into service, and the Warden Car House would be reactivated to maintain the cars. A year later, in 1928, the TTC cut back service on the Scarborough line to Birchmount Road. They would re-gauge and double-track their route west of Birchmount to Victoria Park and extend service on the Kingston Road streetcar to the new Birchmount Loop. Kingston Road cars would operate every 12 minutes, while service on the Scarborough line to West Hill was every half hour. By the late 1920s, the Scarborough line was in decline, as its ridership, which wasn't all that strong to begin with, was losing market share to the rapidly expanding presence of suburban bus lines. Part of the reason for this decline was the fact that the Scarborough line, like all of Toronto's other interurbans, didn't go into downtown Toronto. Riders were forced to transfer to local streetcars, first at Queen Street, then Victoria Park, and by 1928, Birchmount Road. The other reason was, as stated before, the Scarborough line was the weakest of Toronto's interurbans, as the areas it served were the slowest to develop. Sure, the areas west of Victoria Park had developed due to the Scarborough line, expanded streetcar service, and natural spillover from the city. However, beyond Victoria Park there wasn't a whole lot going on, and everything east of Victoria Park was arguably a money pit. This is why the Toronto and Scarborough Company was so reluctant to extend the route into Scarborough in the first place. Either way, the TTC would take notice of the rapidly growing suburban bus lines and would establish their own bus operator, Grey Coach Lines. In April of 1929, Grey Coach would purchase Collicutt bus lines, which ran 8 round trips a day between Toronto and Oshawa and 2 round trips to Coburg via Kingston Road. Then General Manager of the TTC David William Harvey would state that the TTC could abandon the greater part of the radial railway to West Hill, producing a savings of $40,000 a year. That's $781,241.76 per year in 2025 dollars. At the end of the summer season in 1929, Scarborough Heights Park would be closed, although major redevelopment of the land wouldn't start until the 1950s. The end for service on the Scarborough line would come in stages. First, on July 13, 1930, service east of Scarborough Post Office was ended. Service would be replaced by Grey Coach bus service. As the Great Depression hit, the Scarborough line, which was never a heavy hitter in the ridership department, lost even more riders. On June 26, 1936, all remaining service on the Scarborough line would be ended. The tracks beyond Birchmount Road were soon torn up and the Warden Car House torn down. The Scarborough Interurban was dead, ending 43 years of service. While the Scarborough line was gone, service into at least the southwest portion of the township would continue through the Kingston Road streetcar to Birchmount Road. However, that too would end as on July 1st, 1954, service on the Kingston Road streetcar would be cut back to Bingham Loop at Victoria Park Avenue. Scarborough now had no more streetcar service. That said, the section of the route between Queen Street and Victoria Park is still intact and is still used to this day by the 503 Kingston Road. This is also the oldest part of the route, having been in use since 1875 in one form or another, save for an 8-year gap in the 1880s. That said, beyond Victoria Park Avenue, there is really nothing left of the Scarborough line, with one possible exception. This median along Faircroft Boulevard may in fact be the right-of-way used by the Scarborough line spur into Scarborough Heights Park. The left side of the street wasn't added until the 1950s. While you can no longer see it, up until 2013 you could see a stub track at Victoria Park Avenue hinting at the former service that used to extend beyond into Scarborough. The site of the old Warden car house is now a housing complex. The site of the former Walter Street shed is now St. John Catholic School. Of Toronto's interurbans, one could argue the Scarborough line was the weakest as its ridership was always lower than its compatriots. This definitely stems from the fact that the Scarborough line wasn't as successful as routes like the Metropolitan and Mimico in developing streetcar suburbs. It's hard to say if this was an issue with the line itself or Scarborough Township not being as aggressive in its effort to develop areas along the route as it could have been. It's not as if Kingston Road wasn't an important road, as it very much was. Until the opening of Highway 401, Kingston Road was the main artery between the city and everything east of it. By comparison, the main driving force of the Metropolitan line was to connect the municipalities along Yonge Street to the city. While the Mimico line was conceived to be a tool for land development in the village of New Toronto. It seems the strategy with the Scarborough line was to use the route as a means to establish resorts and pleasure grounds and then hope that development spurs from that. It's no secret that Toronto and Scarborough didn't want to extend its service into Scarborough as it saw it as nothing but a money pit. Ultimately though, the Scarborough line would bring development to the areas around Kingston Road. This is most noticeable west of Midland Avenue, where you can still see many two-story mixed-use buildings on the north side of the road. Whatever the case may be, the Scarborough line managed to trundle on for 43 years and even outlived the Mimico line and the first incarnation of the Metropolitan line. Of course, the question now is, what would Scarborough be like if the route wasn't shut down? Would there still be streetcars trundling up Kingston Road to West Hill? Would it have been converted into an LRT line at some point, or maybe even a subway line? Would Scarborough's downtown core have developed along Kingston Road instead of McCowan? Or was the Scarborough line doomed regardless and Kingston Road destined to be a bus route? Looking into the future, it is possible that a small section of the route between Eglinton and Morningside Avenues may be revived as part of the Eglinton East LRT. However, the rest of the route to Victoria Park Avenue is harder to say as there are no plans to develop any kind of higher order transit on this part of Kingston Road, be it streetcar, LRT, or BRT. I personally see value in doing something here as a means to connect Southwest Scarborough with the city and the rest of Scarborough. However, only time will tell if anything gets built here. And with that, I will end this video here. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the channel, and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about the Scarborough Interurban, don't be afraid to do so in the comments section down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.